are listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96 with Melinda Francis, a.k.a. Mali Docuvixen, and Norman Richmond, a.k.a. Jalali. And we just completed Tea in Providence's Jazz Zone. And we're on the line with Dr. Gerald Horne, author of a brand spanking book called The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery, Jim Crow, and the Roots of American Fascism. And how are you doing today, sir?
Hey, it's all good. Hey, can I crowdsource a request?
Yes, sir.
Well, one, as you know, I'm looking for a French language publisher to publish my book on the Haitian Revolution, which has been translated into French, but my publisher has fallen through the cracks. So if anybody can email you or me about a contact with a French language publisher, particularly in Quebec, where you have a sizable population of Haitian descent, I would appreciate it. And second of all, as you know more than most, I spoke up vigorously on behalf of Chairman Yasha Taylor, who was under siege by the FBI a few weeks ago. And now, a week from today, and you can find this on one of my Facebook pages, I've been asked by the U.S. Communist Party to address a global conference on imperialism, wherein I plan to make the proposal that United States may be on the verge of fascism, which will not only be pulverizing for the US people, but for the world as well. Hence, we need a global movement. And I'm suggesting that just as some decades ago, we had a committee in solidarity with the people of El Salvador to help those struggling people, we need a committee in solidarity with the people of the United States, a global movement, anti-fascist movement, and that there be picket lines established at U.S. consulates and embassies around the world, including Toronto, that would focus in the first instance on the terrible, horrific conditions of Black people, police killings, disproportionately cited on death row, disproportionately incarcerated, one of the most imprisoned, heavily imprisoned people on planet Earth. So let's get this movement off the ground.
Yeah, we just did a piece with Harold Wilton on Ruchell McGee, and Ruchell McGee did 1 and 1A and 1B in terms of political prisoners in the U.S. Am I correct in saying that, or am I close to being correct?
Well, I'm not sure if you could be more correct. Ruchell McGee is going to figure the book that I write after the book I'm writing now on the movements in Southern California in the 60s and 70s. Of course, in a sense, he comes out of Southern California. At least that's where he was jailed.
Arrested,
right. Imprisoned, and has been, as you know, behind bars for decades now.
In Angola, you talked about that many times. The prison, Angola, taking its name after a country that you're very familiar with, Angola.
Yeah, but he's been, of course, in California, as you know.
Yeah, for years. Most of his life.
Yes.
I think he was only in California for 6 months before he was arrested. Yes, but he spent, I guess, the first part of his life in Franklin, Louisiana, I believe.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So let me turn to this question of the death of former Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev, the last president of the Soviet Union, who passed away a few days ago at the age of 91. As I pointed out in my almost 900-page book on Southern Africa that came out a few years ago, the Gorbachev policies had devastating consequence for Southern Africa. That is to say, Washington and Moscow began to try to settle what they call regional conflicts, including those in Southern Africa. And so you saw that Moscow basically pulled the plug on the African National Congress and its ally, the South African Communist Party. In fact, I quote a letter that I had written to the then radical weekly in Manhattan, The Guardian, in 1988, where I warned precisely against that prospect. Although I had a few caveats to sort of shield myself from the brickbats of Gorbachev's supporters. But in any case, it's no accident, as I point out in my book, that the apartheid authorities began to negotiate with the African National Congress just shortly after the Berlin Wall falls in November 1989. And as I point out at the time, they made it clear that they were doing so because they thought that their opposite numbers in the ANC and the SACP would be on the back foot. Mandela was released a few weeks later. And so when Moscow removed itself from the equation, this left the anti-apartheid forces out on a limb. And so they were not able to negotiate effectively. And I would argue that South Africa continues to pay the price. That is to say, the Africans in particular continue to pay the price for that Gorbachev decision. But I found it unseemly, what was typical, this dancing on the grave of the former Soviet Union that you saw performed so adroitly in Washington, Ottawa, and the other North Atlantic capitals, because what they failed to realize is that what helped to put pressure on the Soviet Union, causing the policies of Gorbachev, was, of course, the alliance that imperialism made with religious zealots, not least in Afghanistan, where the Soviet Union had intervened on behalf of a left-leaning government, and the United States aligned with religious zealots, some of whom were portrayed and glorified. And I think it was Rambo 3, with Sylvester Stallone, met in the Oval Office with Ronald Wilson Reagan, called freedom fighters. And now, of course, we are told that on September 11, 2001, that allies of these zealots attacked New York and Washington to devastating consequence. And then let's not forget, of course, the alliance with China, which in turn attacked Vietnam. I only mention this because a lot of people are not aware of this. It's not. I'm not a China basher. As a matter of fact, I've been accused nowadays of being the exact opposite. But I think people need to know the history of how we got to this point. And so in return for that alliance, China got massive direct foreign investment. Now the United States is trying to bring China to its knees. Ironically, I'm old enough to remember when Maoist China was charging the Soviet Union with selling out because the Soviet Union was calling for peaceful coexistence with capitalism. And Mao said, no, even though the peaceful coexistence did not mean you didn't support national liberation movements, at least that was the case in the 60s and 70s and a good deal of the 80s. And now, of course, the line from Beijing, now they're dealing with these madmen in Washington, is, of course, precisely a peaceful coexistence. And to go back to that Afghanistan question, China even collaborated with U.S. imperialism with the religious zealots in Afghanistan, even though that had negative fallout for its own Muslim population in West Africa. And of course, the United Nations just issued a report prompted by Washington saying that China is committing massive human rights violations against the Uyghur population in Western China. But even if you don't accept that analysis I put forward, the question that needs to be answered is this: why, after the Soviet Union was overthrown and these oligarchs, a term not used in the United States, even though you have oligarchs here, look at Bezos, Musk, Gates, et al. But anyway, after the resources were privatized, why wasn't Russia accepted at the top table of the capitalist countries? And I think that if you understand the Ukraine conflict, you'll get an idea of why not. go back and look at the article I wrote in the Black Agenda Report in early March of this year, where I tried to provide context for the conflict in Ukraine, pointing out that if you look at your map, you see this gigantic country in Europe called Russia, and all of these smaller countries that are the leading imperialist powers: Britain, France, Germany. And if Russia had been invited to the top table, there's only so much room at the top. We already see that these Western European countries are heavily dependent upon Russia. They would have been even more dependent if Russia had been invited to the top table. And so now the plan basically is to bring back a Yeltsin-type sellout government. That's the government that followed Gorbachev, President Yeltsin in Russia, which brought the country further to its knees. And that's now backfiring, because now it seems as if the Western European nations are sanctioning themselves. Their energy prices are going through the roof. Inflation is going through the roof. People are going to freeze in the dark in London and Paris and perhaps Germany too. And it's not enough to say, as I've heard some folks say, that the United States had to expand NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, to Russia's borders because Poland and other Eastern European nations demanded it. Well, Poland is demanding trillions of dollars in reparations for Germany. That doesn't mean the United States has to support it. Norman Richmond might want to become admitted to the graduate school in business of Stanford University. That doesn't mean they have to admit him. And so I think that's poppycock, this idea that you have to do whatever Poland and the Baltic Republic says. And in any case, it ignores the previous pre-1917 history, where many of these nations were close to Moscow, close to St. Petersburg, because they saw Russia as protecting them against the depredations of the Ottoman Turks. That is to say, Bulgaria in particular, which Russia helps to rescue from Turkish depredations in 1877-78. Now, of course, most of these people we're pronouncing on Eastern Europe don't have a clue about this sort of thing.
History.
Sorry?
I said they don't know anything about the history of that part of the world.
Oh, of course not. I mean, you know, the ignorance in this country is just astonishing. But in any case, as we speak, it's clear that U.S. imperialist and North Atlantic policy has backfired. As we speak, Russia and China are back together again and are holding war games. Vostok, which also interestingly includes a small contingent from India, which is quite intriguing given their not positive relations with China. And here's the other point that I should stress this afternoon, is that you saw the news a few days ago, whereby the North Atlantic countries, led by the United States and Canada, are going to try to put a cap on the price of oil and the price of energy from Russia. Now, number one, I thought that these people were free market devotees. They didn't believe in government intervening in the free market and free floating prices. Well, I guess there are exceptions to that rule. And secondly, there are antitrust laws in the United States that kind of regulation, at least on its face, tend to violate. But in any case, I think that setting those 2 points aside, what's at play is much more nefarious. I think that the North Atlantic countries led by the United States are really trying to overthrow OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, which in the 1970s, as you know, inflicted major damage on the U.S. economy in particular, when led by Saudi Arabia, and Nigeria, these nations got together. And if Washington can set the oil price with regard to Russia, that'll have knock-on effects with regard to capping the oil price from Saudi Arabia, Nigeria, and Angola. And I think that that's recognized in Abuja, in Luanda, and in Riyadh. And I think that's one of the reasons why President Xi Jinping is expected in Riyadh any day now. And keep in mind as well that what tipped Japan into the Pacific War 80 years ago was precisely the North Atlantic countries tampering with its energy supply. But now the shoe is on the other foot. It seems that the North Atlantic countries are trying to control the energy supply because obviously their gambit in Russia has backfired. And so they're observing the credo of the late Pentagon chief Donald Rumsfeld, who once announced that if you have a problem, the way to deal with that problem is to enlarge the problem, because that creates a new dynamic. And so they have a problem right now with energy from Russia. So now they're going to enlarge the problem by, in a sense, going after energy producers generally. This can only end in tears and catastrophe.
Could I ask you, how should Africa, Africans, and oppressed humanity, how should we view Mr. Putin?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I think it has to be on a case-by-case analysis. I think that with regard to this conflict in the Ukraine, I think that the way we've suffered under the heel of NATO in Libya in the 1970s with the Portuguese colonies, Portugal being a charter member of NATO. Speaking of Angola, there are depredations in Angola and Mozambique. It would be a disaster for NATO to be strengthened as a result of this conflict with Russia. I think that that's an easy case. Other cases are more complicated that we'll have to deal with on a case-by-case basis. But what this reminds me of is something I think ultimately that we're going to have to have a reckoning with post-Soviet Moscow, just like we're going to have a reckoning, I'm afraid to say, with many of our erstwhile friends in the Arab world, many of our erstwhile friends in the Muslim world. We're going to have a reckoning with China, as I intimated a few moments ago. But as President Lincoln, a man I don't usually quote, said during the U.S. Civil War, when he was being encouraged to attack Great Britain because of a fear that Great Britain would support the slave-owning states, that is to say the so-called Confederacy, Lincoln said, well, let's fight one war at a time. And that's what I think Black people should do. Let's fight one war at a time. We got our hands full of fighting U.S. imperialism and its acolytes. So once we bring them to heel, we'll go into these other problems.
And we're speaking with Dr. Gerald Horne, the author of The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery, Jim Crow, and the Roots of American Fascism. And Melinda, do you have a question?
Yeah, I'm just curious about what your update for Handmaid's Tale is.
Oh, yeah. Well, I finished the series thus far. And the point, actually, I made this point to our mutual friend, Ryan, where I said that, I'll quote from my message to Ryan. Quote, I won't quarrel with the critiques of Handmaid's Tale, for a number of reasons, creative and narratological. I understand why certain choices were made by the filmmakers. For example, the horrifically sensitive nub of that series is mass rape. Number one, mass rape of women of color, as has been the history of white supremacy and imperialism, could be triggering and traumatizing on the screen, even more than what was occurring to women defined as, quote, white, unquote, on the screen. Number two, the latter group, speaking of these women defined as white, vote for the right at a rate of 50%. And so I think it's politically legitimate to target this group with propaganda in order to shake them up or perhaps nudge them to the left. So that was my approach to the critique of Handmaid's Tale, the idea that it was focusing heavily upon Euro-American women. I think that was a legitimate political and creative choice. In any case, there is the friend, the proverbial friend. You always see that in these Hollywood movies. Think Jennifer, the sister from Chicago who was in Dreamgirls.
Yes.
What's her name?
Hudson, right.
Jennifer Hudson. You know, she always plays the best friend of some Euro-American woman, like Sarah Jessica Parker and someone like that. And so you have that character in Handmaid's Tale, who interestingly enough winds up in the site called Jezebel, quote unquote, which is a house of prostitution for these hypocritical religious zealots of the right. And of course, you don't see her in any intimate scenes, fortunately, with any of her clients. So on the whole, I think that The Handmaid's Tale hopefully will have impact upon that 50% of Euro-American women who vote for the right, even though it'll probably take more than one dramatic series to shake them out of their torpor.
Well, what do you think about her, how would you put her politics? What do you think about her politics, though?
Oh, Margaret, I'm not familiar with. That's one of your homegirls. As a matter, another point about the Handmaid's Tale, where I understand, because dealing with Canadians for a number of years, many of our friends on the Canadian left, they don't like to see Canada portrayed positively, which I understand. So in this movie, Canada is like the sanctuary. It's the promised land. Everybody's trying to escape to Canada. They have scenes from Toronto where people are chilling and, it's totally normalized, trying to escape this terrible United States. And so a lot of the Canadian left doesn't like that. But I mean, I have to say, from my point of view, I had no particular quarrel with that.
Well, the Native American sister, First Nation sister, that was basically her critique. I think I sent that to you, and I put it on Facebook, YouTube, and on Facebook. I'm having a senior moment. I can't think of the First Nation sister's name, but that was her major criticism, that Atwood was basically too soft on. She didn't take into. Well, she basically equated the woman's question with a colonial question. Essentially, they were saying that they were the same.
Well, I mean, I think that's a leap. I mean, I think it was as I said, I think it's propaganda. It's legitimate in the United States, at least. I leave Canada to the Canadians. But in the United States, it's legitimate to target Euro-American women as a group, since 50% of them vote for the right. We got to do something about that. Since in many ways, the bulk of the Euro-American community across class lines are women. And so we're slipping towards fascism. So, and if we slip towards fascism, they will be perpetrators, and some of them might wind up being victims. So I think it's in that context, it's legitimate. Now, for the Canadian context, I'll leave that to Canadians.
Let me say that before I go back to Melinda. The whole fact that Trump received so much support, I think that's really an indictment of Euro-American women. I guess you said that about 50,000 times since we've been on the radio.
Oh, well, clearly. And we got, something must be done. We can't go on like this. I mean, that's why I'm advocating this worldwide solidarity committee in solidarity with the people of the United States, because even Biden says we're slipping towards fascism. Of course, many of our left-wing friends, they don't like to hear that, because they say that if you agree with Biden, that means that you're in the pocket of the Democratic Party. So I guess we'll be debating that in the concentration camps.
I'm not laughing because it's funny. I'm laughing because it's what is, as Smokey Robinson said, I'm laughing to keep from crying.
I hear you.
Melinda, you have some questions?
Yeah, well, we have like a long list here. Do we want to go into Ethiopia?
Yeah, it's quite a crisis. You know that the Tigrayan region, it's only 6% of the population in Ethiopia. It erupted last year. For a while, it seemed they were about to seize Addis Ababa. Then the regime was able to fight back. Apparently, it got help with drones from United Arab Emirates and the Turks and beat back the Tigrayans we thought were subdued. But now the conflict has arisen once more. The Tigrayans are involved not only in this murderous conflict with the central government in Addis Ababa, but also they have this murderous conflict with the Amhara, who like to style themselves as the natural rulers in Addis Ababa, although the Tigrayans, since they were ruling from 1991 up until a few years ago, they see themselves as the natural rulers. And then the government in Addis Ababa has a similar conflict with regard to Oromia. They have a similar conflict that's just intruded with regard to neighboring Somalia, Al-Shabaab, the group that the United States is fighting in Somalia, has been involved in Ethiopian affairs. And then, of course, how could I forget that despite the fact that neighboring Eritrea is ethnically close to the Tigrayans, of course, the Tigrinya language is spoken widely in Eritrea, they've been hammering the Tigrayans in Ethiopia in conjunction with the Addis regime. So the mediation efforts have not borne fruit. That is to say, the efforts of President Kenyatta outgoing in Nairobi, President Obasanjo, former Nigerian leader. So things don't look very good right now, which is unfortunate since Ethiopia is the second most populous nation on the continent. That if this situation spins out of control, it'll inevitably involve neighboring countries. Speaking of Egypt, which has a bone to pick with Ethiopia because of the Grand Renaissance Dam, it'll probably drag in Yemen and Saudi Arabia, perhaps the Israelis, given the significant percentage of Israeli nationals who are who have roots in Ethiopia. So this is a major crisis, and this is a crisis where I would like to, well, actually there is a Chinese mediation effort, but I'd like to see a Chinese and Russian mediation effort.
Yes. I think this is going to be the final question, Dr. Horne. Could you first of all tell us who was Esther Jackson and the fact that she passed away at 101? Yeah, who was Esther Jackson for people that don't know? Big pardon?
105, actually. Yeah, I wrote a piece on Black Agenda.
105, I'm sorry.
About her and Louise Thompson Patterson and Dorothy Burnham, who is now 108 and going strong. They were all comrades in the movement with ties more or less to the U.S. Communist Party. Esther, who I knew, I talk about that in the article. I used to write for the journal that she and John Henrik Clarke and Shirley Graham Du Bois founded. Speaking of Freedom Ways, I wrote my first article there in the mid-1970s on Cuba after visiting the island, and wrote for them until they were driven out of business in the mid-1980s. She also was, in addition to being an editor, she was an activist with the Southern Negro Youth Congress, which went into the heart of darkness, that is Birmingham, as early as the 1940s, in order to try to break down the walls of Jim Crow. So did Dorothy Burnham, too, by the way, who, as I said, is now 108 years old. So Esther passed away just a few days ago at 105. It's quite a loss. I would like to think that her living to 105 and Dorothy Burnham still going strong at 108. Let's hope that we can infer that being in revolutionary politics keeps you young.
I think the first time I saw you was in, I think we spoke, but it was in the 70s. It was at a nightclub, and Charles Roach had you and Charles Roach were comrades, but Charles Roach said that I guess you were in Cuba in the 70s with Charles Roach.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's probably the occasion on which I wrote that article. Also, as part of that delegation was Gay McDougall. If you look at pictures of Mandela casting his first vote in 1994, next to Mandela is Gay McDougall, who went on to become a leading figure in the anti-apartheid movement. She was part of that delegation to Cuba as well.
What's the brother's name from Namibia? I keep on mispronouncing his name.
Yeah, Toivo Yotoivo.
You wrote about him.
Yeah,
you wrote about him.
Yeah, he was. I visited Namibia as a journalist just before it was freed, just before it had elections. And then after Toivo was freed from prison, he was one of Mandela's cellmates. I raised money, including, as I just wrote, I raised $5,000 from the late Congressman George Crockett of Detroit for this venture to bring him and some comrades to the United States to tour. And escaping from my jurisdiction while he was in the United States, Comrade Toivo Yotoivo was able to forge a relationship with this woman who we eventually married, who is still in the Middle.
I remember.
He passed away a few years ago.
Yeah, I remember that. Anything else you wanted to add or anything, Melinda?